Wrestlebuddy podcast, all about wrestling. Subscribe and follow for more content.
Welcome, Wrestle Buddies, to yet another one of our amazing interviews. And this time, we've got a fantastic pro wrestler, multifaceted, as he said before we started. We have Alex Shelly with us today. How are you doing, Alex?
I'm doing well. How are you two doing?
I'm doing all right. I had to rush back. That was fun.
You and me both.
Yeah, I got here about 2.5 hours ago. I work overnight, so I've been up.
Yeah, that's a rough shift, Nate.
Well, let's get the boring, typical interview questions out of the way first. What got you into loving pro wrestling?
Oh, man. As far as what got me into pro wrestling, I think probably around like age 9 or 10. Of course, children are fascinated with things that are bright and colorful and not necessarily based in reality. And I think that's why children intentionally are marketed towards with cartoons and nowadays Pokemon and video games and movies. And it's a whole different sect, right? So you respect that. I think for me, though, as somebody who played sports growing up always and who was involved in a sports-centric family, both my parents were athletes, my siblings are athletes, the combination of basically real-life superheroes and athletics that were combined into pro wrestling to create what at the time was WWF was eye-catching. And I came into it as a fan around 94, 95, when they were just starting to see more athletic, smaller wrestlers take center stage. So I think ultimately it was that type of presentation as far as like the characters and the costumes and the music. And then on top of that, too, the agility and the acrobatics and the athleticism of a sect of wrestlers at that point in time that were being featured.
And growing up around that time, like you said, you started watching, really getting into it around 94, 95.
Yeah.
Who was your, I'd say, role model? Who was your wrestling idol growing up?
There were a handful of them that to me were eye-catching right out of the gate. And I remember around that time period, one of the moments that absolutely made me think, wow, this is really not what I thought it was. Because having grown up in Metro Detroit, which was WWF territory, of course you saw WWF, but it was mainly the super heavyweights of the 80s and the early 90s. And I remember seeing Sean Waltman hit a moonsault on Razor Ramon. And that was one of the pivotal moments, right? I remember seeing Jushin Liger wrestle Brian Pillman. That was pivotal. And I remember seeing Owen Hart and Shawn Michaels specifically, and those two in particular really captivated.
What would have been your favorite match around that time?
I think for me, the one that was like the most awe-inspiring was probably the first ladder match between Razor Ramon and Shawn Michaels. That was when I saw something that I just could not believe, right? Like it's just, they didn't do gimmick matches very often back then, which I think is probably a good thing. I almost wish wrestling would go more in that direction now, to whereas it would be treated very, very specially rather than just kind of thrown out there. And I remember being in TNA and we would do ladder matches just at the drop of a dime. And it was mainly to pop a rating. It was just there to be there. And to be fair, they're an art form, just like anything else. But at the same time, I think if you treat them as an attraction and a spectacle, it is more valuable. For example, everybody goes to see fireworks on 4th of July, right? If you saw fireworks once a month, every month, it probably wouldn't be as spectacular or as must-see on the 4th of July. So with that being stated, and not having seen any ladder matches up to that point, or not seeing any ladder matches for a long period of time after that, that was the one that I think really stuck out to me as something that was absolutely mind-boggling.
I actually fully agree with that.
Oh, what a match, right?
Yeah. But also Phil personally that you should, if you're going to do a gimmick match, it should be at the end of a feud that actually deserves it instead of just there for the sake of it.
Sure, and I think that's relatively subjective, as all wrestling is,
Yeah.
to be honest with you. And of course, every company has its own reality. We have to consider this too. So there's going to be more frequency of these types of things in certain territories than there would be in others. But that's just my particular bias. And obviously you agree with it.
Going back to you getting into the business, what wrestling school did you go to? How did you get into the business itself?
So when I first started training, it was coming off of a boom period. I stepped in a ring for the first time in August 2001. And at that point in time, maybe 6 months prior, WWF had developed ECW and WCW. There were no more major companies in North America. However, the NWA had been on the cusp of a resurgence. And in this particular incarnation, it was more so independent companies flying the flag and getting access to a handful of champions who worked for the NWA. There was an NWA Great Lakes, and they were based in Metro Detroit, and they had a wrestling school. And that was the first school I went to. And at that point in time, it was relatively easy to go online and find a school. However, this is probably at the beginning of wrestling schools being more populous. And just because a wrestling school is nearby doesn't necessarily mean it's a great school. So the first school I went to was very rudimentary, very, very basic. The way I got most of my training after that, after about 6 months of training, once a week, I had my first match, and I would do ring crew, I would do security, I would do anything I was told at local independent shows. And I would show up every weekend, multiple times a weekend. Do you need help, sir? Please, sir. If anybody doesn't show up, I'd be happy to fill in. On top of that, a couple schools that were much closer to my house were kind enough, because I was already trained, to let me train with them. So I was able to learn from more veterans around the local circuit. And eventually you get booked more and more, because invariably people are not going to show up. Things happen, right, on shows all the time. Like somebody gets hurt, transportation problems, whatever the case may be. And you get your reps in. And if you're good, they ask you to come back. And on top of that, I was fortunate enough to have a travel partner in Jimmy Jacobs. And he was about the same age as me, but he was very, very willing to get out and drive, just drive for 3, 4, 5, 6 hours. And I was more than happy to drive with him. And having a partner in crime, we were able to pick up shows every single weekend. So it became a matter of, here's my training, here's my advancement of training, because after going once a week for 6 months and I found the schools that were nearby, now I can go 2 to 3 times a week and really, really practice things. And I'm wrestling once or twice on the weekends too. So if I'm in a ring 4 or 5 days a week for about 6 to 8 to 9 months, your skill set's going to develop rapidly if you have proper guidance. And I was very fortunate to have that.
Do you have any questions about that beginning period time, Bam?
I'm trying to think. Because I'm terrible. I'm a mess of a human. I love the way you talk about how it's important to actually look for schools that are good, and how valuable it is to actually train under veterans of the local industry. I really appreciate that, because like the scene's a little bit smaller here in England. So it's very difficult.
What city are you in?
Well, I'm not in a city. I'm 40 minutes outside of London.
Okay. Yeah, there's a lot of wrestling in England. But there's a lot of good trainers too, from what I've been told.
Yeah.
You know, England geographically is about the size of Michigan, which is to say that it's a pretty good sized piece of land. And if I were to compare the amount of wrestling in England versus Michigan, there's much, much, much more in England. And I think sometimes too, as far as training goes, people are going to have more options in your country. Well, over here, it's mainly what's closest. And yeah, nobody wants to like travel 2 or 3 hours to train every week, but it can be done. On top of that, though, here it's like there's a school in Michigan and there's probably one that's good, maybe two. And if you go through every state, you might have one solid school, and whether or not that's even close to you, because, you know, retrospectively speaking, I went to the one that was most accessible to me. If we consider the overall size of the US versus England, you're basically talking 50 small countries, really, which is why our country is the way it is, you know, socioeconomically, especially. And it's tough for wrestlers here to get started and really make a name for themselves, because if they're in a certain place, it's just not accessible for them to drive 5-6 hours. There might not be anything with exposure or solid talent for which they can learn from. So it can be more of a challenge over here, I think. That's my personal, you know, take on it. But obviously, starting out anywhere is not easy. No,
it's not easy at all. And I really appreciate the fact that you talk about that, because, you know, if anyone wants to get into it, especially like over in America, they need to know, like, it can be done, but it is difficult. So you have to really have passion for it and really want to do it.
Without a doubt. You know, you look at somebody like, I'll use Lee Moriarty as an example because I know him very well.
He's amazing.
Yeah, he's very good, but he's actually been around for quite a while. Like, he took a couple years off, I believe, because of a shoulder injury, and I think he's been wrestling at this point like 7 or 8 years. And people think like, oh, he just showed up. Like, no, he didn't just show up. He was grinding on the independents for years before he actually got a spotlight put on him. And I think that's more common than you realize in the US. Like, these guys will wrestle for 5, 6, 7, 10 years before they actually catch a break, so to speak. And nowadays, I see wrestlers starting later than I did. I started when I was a teenager, and that was more normalized back then. But to hear that, oh yeah, I had my first match when I was 18 now, is definitely the exception and not the rule. Now you have a lot of people going through university first and acquiring some sort of education or a skilled trade and then getting into wrestling. And I think that's probably the better way to do it. If I had to pick between the two, I wouldn't change anything that I did in particular. But if I look at what that affords you, if you're able to actually acquire some sort of occupation or career, and succeed outside of wrestling, you typically end up with more resources with which to work when you start out. And that's important, right? Because wrestling is going to cost money and it's going to cost you time at the very, very least. It's going to take those two things. So if you want to be able to have your fitness on point and your nutrition on point and your gear on point, and you want to be able to afford to drive somewhere and get paid, but not get paid a lot, you know, petrol is expensive and you're putting miles on your car, it doesn't hurt to necessarily have some sort of steady income on top of that.
Yes.
Yeah. That's my TED talk as far as people who are starting out.
Now, you said like you were working for and with the NWA of your local town. Did that help you get like right with the NWA TNA as it started out?
Oh, definitely not. I mean, it was such a how can I put this? NWA TNA at the time was part of the NWA from what I understand, but I think it was kind of to just have that NWA name for them. So it was basically like the Tennessee version of the NWA promoted by the Jarretts. I don't think anybody that I know of who was like an NWA champion per se at that point in time ended up getting more than maybe like a match or two on TNA. It became its own entity pretty quick.
Yeah. Going into your time with TNA, you spent a lot of your early career there. Any cool stories or like helping build that brand to what it became in the early 2010s?
If we're talking early 2010s, honestly, I was out, and mentally I was checked out by, probably by like 2010, to be honest with you. Like, I knew I was going to leave the company in 2010. I had my mind made up at that point. I was already in university outside of wrestling. I wasn't really necessarily like enjoying it as far as having fun with it. it was more like I was doing it as a job. Although I will say that wrestling Beer Money or the Young Bucks was so much fun. Or if I got to get in the ring with Doug Williams or Okada or Spanky or Amazing Red or Jay Lethal or anybody like that, it was a blast. But for the most part, I really looked at it as a job. And this is my job, and I'm going to go to work. And then when I'm done with work, I'm done with work. And I'm going to pursue academia outside this. So that time period probably wouldn't be the best to ask me about. Do you have another time period you want to ask me about?
Let's go back about 5-6 years then, about
okay.
that time period, starting like the real X Division, getting all that off the ground.
Mm-hmm. So I would say that in my experiences in the early aughts, as it were, I started there in 2004, and I was definitely an undercard guy. I was only, I think I was 21 when I signed my first contract. I just turned 21, so I was quite young. And I came in, and the X Division was pretty varied at that point. What I mean by that is we had a lot of guys who would fall under the X Division moniker. For example, my first contract, I was there for maybe 6 months before I asked for my release to go to Japan. And in that time period, I swear to God, I probably saw 60 different X Division wrestlers. And I'm talking about guys who were really, really good and world renowned. Like, for example, Hector Garza, Mr. Aguila, Nosawa, Kazushi Miyamoto. And then on top of that, you had all these like American indie guys too. So I would have been in that category because I was like featured in Ring of Honor and CZW and IWA Mid-South quite a bit. And most of the guys in TNA were not. But then you also had guys like Jason Cross from NWA Wildside or Matt Seidel at the time. I think maybe had done a little bit of Ring of Honor and he'd get brought in. Delirious would have been amongst them as well. Puma, who is TJP, he would show up from the time. And it was just this huge like bucket of guys they would just chuck into the X Division. It was really cool, actually, because a lot of these guys were in their late 30s, early 40s, or about my age now. And they were guys I grew up watching. So for me to wrestle Hector Garza, who's absolutely one of my favorite luchadors of all time, one of my favorite wrestlers of all time, like, this is fucking dope. Jerry Lynn was around quite a bit too. And of course, you know, he's got a massive catalog of matches under his belt. That was the first time I was there. So when I came back, I was asked to come back in 2005, and I had been in 01 for about 6 months at this point, and I had been doing Ring of Honor. The X Division was more funneled. So now, because bookers had changed, and that happens so frequently in wrestling, the new booker wanted to narrow it down to maybe like a dozen guys. And I think at that point, the dozen ended up being AJ Joe Daniels, me, Sabin, Lethal, Sanjay, Petey for sure, Kazarian, Michael Shane, maybe one or two more. And I apologize for not like remembering anybody. Shocker would have been in there as well, who was my maestro, my teacher for Lucha Libre, or one of them. And then it became like more kind of streamlined, as it were, and you would see kind of the same people in the X Division over and over again. I feel like that was kind of when it took off, because now you have these guys wrestling each other in some incantation almost every TV taping. And the more you wrestle somebody, the better you're going to get at wrestling them specifically. You're going to get better at wrestling, but you're going to get better at wrestling them. To use it on a more global level, if you were to watch Dragon Gate, which I think Dragon Gate is awesome. You can also apply this to New Japan too. It's the same guys, and it's been the same guys for 10 years or 15 years. Like, these guys have wrestled each other so many times. Imagine how good they get at wrestling each other. It'd be almost like two NFL teams playing each other every other week. And imagine that for like 10 seasons in a row. Like, imagine how well they'd be able to create offense and defense against each other. So I think that familiarity really helped contribute to a lot of the success of the X Division for probably the next like 4 years, 3 to 4 years, I would say, from probably 2005 going on to 2009. I would say the X Division was really, really quite good. And everybody was really pushing each other, like, in a number of ways, in the ring, out of the ring, so on and so forth.
we can't talk about the X division without bringing up Ultimate X itself. How is it participating in a match like that? So something like that.
Ultimate X. So there's a number of different ways to go about that match. The way I treat it is Ultimate X is capture the flag. The objective of this match is to climb that, get that wooden X down as fast as you humanly can, or a belt, or whatever the hell they hang up there that they want to treat as an objective. It was intimidating the first time I did it, simply because I'm not scared of heights to a point, but past a certain point, I probably was at that stage. I'm not so much anymore. And I contribute that to, like, doing climbing and zip lining and things since that. But it's definitely a match that isn't for everybody. Like, I don't know how many people would be super excited about, like, oh, great, Ultimate X match, cool. Like, there's obviously more risk. There's more velocity involved. You're suspended above the ring. Therefore, if you get pulled down and you land wrong, spontaneous patellar combustion, right? Like, these things happen to the best of athletes without falling and landing on their feet from a dozen feet up, or whatever the case may be. Therefore, it's something that's kind of in the back of your mind, like, oh, way up there. At the same time, there's something that athletes at a high level possess called positive arousal, and eustress, positive stress, not distress, but eustress. And oftentimes when I was in the Ultimate X, I would experience that. Like, you don't think about how high up you are anymore, right? You just don't. Like, you can't. You don't have the mental capacity to do it. So when you're hanging upside down, your army crawling across these cables, you stop thinking, what happens if the cable breaks? You just consider what you have to do. But obviously, it's an intimidating match as much as it is a spectacle to watch.
And I think last question of, like, the Impact TNA kind of portion of the questions, who would be your favorite opponent during your time there?
Man, that's really tough. I don't know that I can give you a clean answer. I'll say this much, though. I think there was one person there who was wildly underrated, and everybody enjoyed competing against him, and he would oftentimes push people, and it was Jimmy Rave, who's come across some medical issues lately. So if anybody wants to contribute to his GoFundMe, it would be really cool if they could. But he's kind of like an underrated GOAT. He's somebody who is really, really, really good. And I don't know that he ever got a fair shake as far as showing that at TNA. And he definitely sacrificed his body there too. But he was somebody that, to me, it was always like, I'm wrestling Jimmy. This is awesome. And I had wrestled him multiple times before he ever got to the company. One of my first, like, breakout matches, as it was in CZW, was a submission match against him in 2004. And I was only 20, maybe? I don't even think I was 21. And when I got in the ring with him, I just thought, oh my God, this guy's so good. He is so good. And I don't know if you guys have ever seen Don't Tell Mom the Babysitter's Dead, but there was a movie in the 90s. Do you know what I'm talking about? Have you seen it?
I do, yeah.
Yeah, with example. So I used to wind people up, or wind him up a little bit too, but if we went somewhere in public, I would say, hey, do you recognize him? He was in Don't Tell Mom the Babysitter's Dead. And they go, oh, really? I go, yeah, the Promise Ring, that's him. And he would get really embarrassed and flustered by it. But he looks just like that actor, eh?
He kind of does, now that you mention it.
Especially when we were younger too, because he had a very baby face, even when he was in his 30s. But yeah, I spent a lot of time with him on the road, and we were in CZW and Ring of Honor together, obviously tag team partners later on, then in TNA together. And I thought he was just magnificent. And I think a lot of the guys who wrestled against him would agree with it too. You just don't hear his name bandied about so much as like a Joe or a CD or AJ.
Yeah, Jimmy Rave is one hell of a guy. And like you said, we'll put the GoFundMe link in the description of this video as well, because yeah, I've actually talked with Jimmy Rave after the fact. I reached out to him on Twitter, and yeah, dude is such a good guy. He really is.
Yeah, and I've worked with amputees in my physical therapy career, and it's tough, as one can imagine. And I certainly hope he has the funds or the resources to maximize his function, because it's a tough break. I mean, there's just no way around that. And I think one of the things that people don't understand is a lot of times people who have amputations are in neuropsych for a long time. A lot of times that phantom pain, the nerve endings are severed, and it's very, very painful. And I can only imagine what he's going through. And my heart goes out to him. You know, like when I found out about that stuff, I cried. And it's just like, I'm so sorry you had to deal with that. It's not an easy road to recovery. And, you know, it's really, really tough losing not only bilateral lower extremities, but obviously one of your uppers as well. And, you know, that's just a really, really tough break. But I mean, he's still with us, thank God. And yeah, anything anybody can do to help out financially, I'm sure he would appreciate.
All right, so we're gonna move off of the TNA Impact side, and we're gonna go over to Bam about some of your time in Japan.
Okay.
I love Japan. So my big question is, what was it actually like working with Kashida? Because you guys as a tag team was incredible, and I just would love to know that.
Sure. So I had actually seen Kushida in 2006 on video. I didn't watch much New Japan back then. The company that I did follow most closely was 01 Max, because that was the company that I spent about 2 years in. That was the company that created the Motor City Machine Guns. And my senpai, my mentor there, I had a few, Otani and Tanaka were amongst them, but Ikuto Hidaka was my main senpai. And he wrestled a young boy at Korakuen Hall on this particular show who had black trunks, knee pads, and amateur wrestling shoes, and was very good. And it was Kushida. I thought, oh, wow, this guy's like really not bad at all. So eventually some of the 01 guys started working for the reincarnation of Hustle. So Hustle got reincarnated, and they were backed by Dream Stage, which was also the parent company of 01. So there was carryover. And Kushida was on those shows too, and I watched him. And then I found out he was a Tajiri trainee, and I thought, man, this guy's really good. And Tajiri opened up his own company, Smash. Kushida was there. Kushida went to All Japan. Well, All Japan had a working agreement with Can-Am Wrestling, Scott D'Amore's school in Windsor, which is where I trained, one of the schools I trained at. I credit Scott as one of my trainers. He's a magnificent trainer and a great mentor and just an amazing human being. And he would bring over some of the All Japan young boys. Brought over Kushida. So I met Kushida formally in 2009 at a show in Detroit. He wrestled Petey Williams in a singles match, and it was fucking awesome. It was just a great match. And I thought, oh, man, wow, that's so cool. And I'm going to tell him how much I enjoyed this match afterwards and that I'm a fan of his work, because I was. So I met him then and there, and kind of would watch him when he got back to Japan. When he got back to Japan, he changed his aesthetic. And like a lot of people at the time, he ended up looking like a Motor City Machine Gun, right? He wrestled in a manner that was already kind of similar to me anyway. Like, we used a lot of the same techniques to begin with. And in 2012, I knew my contract was going to be up. So I started reaching out to different Japanese companies, and they started reaching out to me. And I had offers from All Japan, Dragon Gate, and New Japan. New Japan I had already worked for. I sent Kushida a message at one point because I was already starting to lean towards them. And Tiger Hattori, who was a ref in Liaison, contacted me and said they were interested. I thought, well, what would be a good idea to like come in to the company, right? And I thought, man, they don't really have any tag teams. At the time, they had Apollo Gogo, which was Fergal and Taguchi, but they really didn't have a ton. And they had Davey Richards and Rocky Romero, but Davey ended up taking a hiatus. Rocky got Kozlov, and I just said, hey, would you be interested in maybe doing this? And again, because we had met, because we had trained under Scott together, because we used some of the same techniques, I bet this would be a good fit. So I ended up in New Japan under contract in 2012. My first tour was in September. And they said, yeah, we're we're going to try and put you guys together as a tag team. So they put us together on some house shows. We started training together in the dojo. I requested to live at the dojo so I could have access to the ring so I could train. And we got in the ring and started training more and more together against each other, with each other. And we're wrestling together and we're on the road. And he speaks pretty good English. And from there, it just took off. And it turns out we had a lot more similarities too. He's actually 2 weeks older than me, but we're both in May, birthdays, 83. And he just became one of my best friends and my brother. At his wedding in Japan, I was best man. You know, I would help him out with whatever I could and vice versa. And when you're wrestling in Japan, as much as I was, you're very much at the mercy of the people around you. Like if they don't want to take care of you, and they don't have to, they certainly do not have to, you're going to be out in the cold. So I was very, very grateful and very honored that he and a lot of the other guys too, like Hanma and Tanahashi especially, would also take care of me, because you just don't speak the language. You're a stranger in a strange land. And I think always respecting the fact that he didn't have to go above and beyond for me, but he would every time. You know, you can't help but like love somebody for that. So we just have a really, really deep bond, really deep connection. But I think a lot of it, as far as just being mechanically compatible, was the fact that we're similar size, similar age, similar backgrounds in training, similar interest in wrestling, similar movesets. And when you factor all that in together, of course, yeah, it seems like a natural fit, and it was.
Oh, sorry. I'm just like, for a second there. Because just, it's great to hear how it came about. And every time I've ever watched both of you together, I fully enjoy it. And I can see the similarities between like the way you both work. So it's really nice to hear like how you guys actually met. And obviously since then you have been able to tag with him in NXT, even if it was briefly. And I got very excited about that. I think a lot of people did.
Me too. And I think had the pandemic not happened, there's a good chance that you would have seen more of us. I'm certain of it, really. But at the same time, I think COVID threw a wrench in most people's plans, myself included. And I think other factors too pertain to this. Like now that I think about it, one critical detail was Kushi didn't start wrestling until 2006. Well, I started in 2001. So there's, 5 years. That's a big gap. He told me later on that he was actually a reporter for one of the newspapers in Japan, and he would cover pro wrestling as well as some other sports. And he would actually go to Korakuen Hall when I was in 01 and watch me. And I always thought that was so cool. Like, what a cool story, And kudos to him, because he was able to like watch it as a fan. And like a year or two later, he's in Korakuen Hall wrestling too on the reg. So I just thought that was really impressive on his end. I want to do this, and then he does it. And that's always cool to hear when people like really have that grit and that drive.
So I did want to actually ask about intergender matches, because I know you have wrestled Kylie Ray. But is there anyone else you would really love to wrestle?
Not necessarily. I really enjoy the independents because there's a wealth of talent out there. And sometimes I don't have the bandwidth right now to watch much wrestling. I really don't. Therefore, the wrestling that I do watch has to be very well researched, or it has to be something that I know I'm going to get something out of. With that being stated, there's a collection of wrestlers that I go to who I know I can draw off of, or I know I enjoy, or there's certain time periods in wrestling that I know I can go back to and learn things from. And I'm trying to make sure that I impress upon the guys who come to me for mentorship and guidance, you have to watch things that are different, because everybody's watching the same thing. And with social media, it makes it very easy to watch the same thing. Here's what's hot. Here's a great match. Watch this. That's fine. And you should probably. At the same time, I feel like there's so much wrestling to take in that you're better off not just digesting a little bit of what's hot now, but really digging through the past and finding different tools with which you can build your own matches, right? Because nobody wants to see a redundant version of a Tokyo Dome match or a WrestleMania match.
Yeah.
So with all that being considered, I trust in the promoters and the promotions that I work for to put me up against quality wrestlers. Are there people I want to wrestle? Yeah, there are. As far as women go, I don't necessarily seek out intergender matches. Yeah. And I hate to say it, but I don't watch much independent wrestling either. The most independent wrestling I see is actually when I'm on shows. If I peek my head through the curtain and I'll watch maybe 90 seconds to 2 minutes of a match, I can usually determine like whether or not somebody's captivated me pretty quickly. And there's some great talent out there. And that's how I've usually found people that I'm interested in, like, oh, wow, they're very different, or they have such a cool look, or wow, that's really impressive. They move really well. So for guys and girls, like that's usually how I end up being exposed to the people on the independents who are really, really awesome.
Speaking of like little time on the indies, you are the current IWTV world champion, are you not?
Correct.
Like you said, with younger talent coming up and looking to you for mentorship, working with someone as young and talented as Wheeler Yuta, how working with the younger talent on the indie scene, how has that kind of sharpened your skills?
I think you actually surmised it pretty well. Like, it sharpens my skills. I have to keep up with them. And symbiotically, they have to keep up with me. So we feed off each other in that regard. But I quite like it because these are new people to wrestle. And I love new experiences. I really do. At least for a brief moment. And to go in there against a Daniel Garcia or a Yuta or Lee Moriarty or Isaiah Velasquez or who else? Like, I just got to wrestle Myron Reed, and there's so many good wrestlers out there. So to have that fresh coat of paint on matches and to have to consider how I'm going to adapt and how I'm going to change opponent to opponent, to me, that's kind of the art of wrestling. And that's part of the reason I'm happy where I'm at.
You actually got to wrestle Matt Cardona recently. What is your opinion on his work currently in GCW?
Well, I can tell you he's the exception, right? Like, you go to a GCW show, right away Matt Cardona looks different than everybody else on the roster.
Yeah.
And I think in a good way. I think that's good. I think it's always good to look different. Like, I think every roster should have wrestlers of different sizes, shapes, ages, genders, all that. I think he's a guy who clearly knows what he's doing. I mean, he's been around about as long as I have. He's about my age. He's obtained much more mainstream success than I have. But I think there's a certain respect that has to be given to guys like that. Like, this guy's been doing it for, well over a decade at a high level and wrestled everybody. I've done a lot of cool things in my career, and I've done a lot of cool things that he has not done. But he's done a lot of cool things that I'll never get to do. I'll never get to wrestle The Undertaker. Think about that for a second. So when you really kind of consider his legacy in wrestling, like, what a pickup for GCW. And I can tell you this much. He inherently believes what he's doing. He's excited about wrestling. He loves pro wrestling. I think he's everything that's right about the independents, even if he's a shitbag to GCW fans, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, like he's just incredible. He is absolutely awesome. I don't have to like the guy, but I can certainly respect him. And he's fucking huge. Like, he's deceptively big, right? I'm a relatively small guy by most standards, or at least average size, according to most national surveys. And, for my height and weight, like, I'm quite muscular, but he's just a big dude. Deceptively so, to the point when you see him on TV, like, yeah, I guess he's a little smaller than John Cena. Well, John Cena is ginormous. So, like, when Cardona shows up on these GCW shows and he's wrestling Effie, you realize how quick he's like dwarfing these grown men. And he wants to work, man. Like, I mean, he does not take days off. Like, he hustles, and his schedule is quite impressive. It's, again, he's got to be respected.
I think that's actually a great segue into some of our fan questions, Bam, because like you were just saying about Cardona and, believing in himself, a lot of people have unfortunately been released by WWE. And one of our fans has asked what your thoughts are on the releases and if you have any advice for them going forward.
As far as advice for people who have been released?
Yeah.
Sure. So I can say this much. Everybody's situation is going to be unique to themselves. I respect that entirely. I can also say that 100% for sure, wrestling needs nobody. We're all very lucky and very fortunate to have a place in this industry, and to do it at a level where you can actually make an income is impressive. To do it at a level where you make a very good income is even more impressive. Nothing lasts forever. That's a fact. And wrestling goes in waves. If you love wrestling, there's a way to make it fit into your life, but it's got to be able to be malleated sometimes. And what I mean by that is it's not always going to be your 24/7 occupation, or it doesn't have to be, or sometimes that's taken away from you, like it is when a wrestling contract is cut or it expires and it's not renewed. That doesn't mean that it's anything against them. It doesn't mean that they're not talented. It doesn't mean that they're any less than anybody who is still employed. It just means that this product doesn't fit into the business model currently. And that's what wrestlers are. We're products. We're a box, and our box has to be able to say that we can do this, and we have to fulfill that. But sometimes you just don't need that anymore in your store. WWE has clearly decided that they have changed their business model, and that's okay. That's like within their right to do. When you really consider how many wrestlers that they had under contract before the pandemic, it was quite impressive, right? I mean, I don't know how many it is, but it had to be hundreds. Even then, when I was growing up watching them, I don't even know if they had like 75. And they weren't under contract either, right? So it's just a different dynamic altogether. I think, again, respecting the idea that the parent company can always change your business model, and that doesn't necessarily mean that it's a strike against anyone, and that WWE has that right to do these things with whatever clause they decide to exercise. There's also the notion that, economically speaking, businesses are tuned up for the most part. The pandemic has hit every level, and I understand that WWE releases maybe like profits or whatever the case may be. I don't pretend to know these things, but at the same time, if you consider that ultimately wrestling is a touring business, I just don't understand how any business in wrestling hasn't lost money since the pandemic. Like, I don't care what company you are. If you were drawing money off the live gate and live merch sales and all of that, then that was put on hold and maybe still hasn't recovered, or maybe it's greatly diminished. Therefore, I understand the idea of like certain industries in the entertainment world not being able to support the amount of people they had employed prior. I would imagine they're not the only ones who are making changes. I would imagine it's something like a Cirque du Soleil, or probably Broadway musicals, operas, touring operas. My sister is an opera singer, and she's in her doctoral music program. And she's told me about friends of hers who had lost their jobs because, the pandemic. You think about like cruise liners, things like that, vacation packages, people who book travel. So like that whole entire sect of the economy is taking a massive beating, and it's still recovering. So hopefully it gets back to normal at some point. On the news this morning, at least in Metro Detroit, they were talking about how travel is almost back to pre-pandemic levels in Detroit Metro Airport. So, I mean, I guess that's a good sign, but you can't control this. And I work with the public, so I've had to hear about all of these different occupations that have lost something because of COVID. And I don't think I've heard anybody say, yeah, I'm doing way better. Like, oh yeah, profits are way up. This is great. maybe there was a spike in profit depending on your business, but you're dealing with some sort of issue, especially now that supply lines are backed up too. I think the only industry I heard of that did well were like your mortgage brokers, your loan officers, your underwriters, things like that. They did pretty good for a period of time, but I think that's cooled off to like more nominal level too. So yeah, I feel bad for anybody that's got to make life changes. But that's not to say that it's going to end up being a bad thing in the long run. Like, I'll be curious to see what it looks like 2 to 3 years from now. There's an Alan Watts story about the Chinese farmer. Alan Watts was a gentleman from England who blended Zen Buddhism and a lot of enlightened theories together, became a philosopher. And the Chinese farmer has all these terrible things happen to him, but it's a bad thing, and then a good thing happens, and a bad thing, then a good thing. And every time people would come up and they would say more or less, "Oh, I'm so sorry that happened to you. That's terrible." And he would say, "Maybe." And then something good would happen. "Oh, that's so wonderful that happened to you. That's good for you. Maybe." And it's always a case of maybe. There's always going to be good and bad. There's always balance.
All right. On to the next question, and this is coming from friend of the channel, from Sweet Chinwag. Being such a creative person in and outside of the ring, what keeps your creative juices flowing and gets you, inspired to create new things?
I think for me, it's a constant thirst to learn, and it's never quite quenched. There isn't a day that goes by that I don't learn something, whether it's about physical therapy or training or about wrestling or reading for entertainment, reading to learn, absorbing new knowledge. And I think having that implemented from a young age, just always being adventurous enough to try new things and to learn new things and wanting to do so and never being satisfied with the level I'm at drives my creativity.
We've got about 10 more minutes left of our interview. Bam, do you have any questions that you would like to ask Alex Shelly personally?
I have stuff written down, but I'm really enjoying just hearing stories. It's kind of my whole thing. When you're in 0-1, because like my knowledge of that isn't great, and I'm sure there are a lot of people who don't have like that knowledge as much knowledge on that as they do of like somewhere like New Japan. Who did you enjoy like most getting to?
And operating company now. But when I got there, the guys that I was most excited to wrestle were Steve Corino, Spanky, Shinjiro Otani, Masato Tanaka, and there's a junior heavyweight tag team, Akito Hidaka and Minoru Fujita. I would say those 6 names when I first got there were paramount. Since then, they added a guy named Takuya Sugawara, who's from the Dragon Gate system originally, and he was phenomenal. I also got to wrestle Dick Togo, which was just fucking awesome because Dick Togo was a guy that I watched so much of growing up. When I was growing up, the main company I watched as far as Japanese wrestling went was Michinoku Pro Wrestling. And this was at a time when they were just shit hot. I mean, they were so good, and they had so many good wrestlers, and they were kind of one of the first ones to blend Lucha Libre and Japanese style wrestling and have these 6-man tags that were just action packed. Without them, there wouldn't have been a Dragon Gate, I don't think, as far as how Dragon Gate presented its action. And wrestling all of them, I was able to learn so much. Not only that, but kind of by virtue of where I was able to be around, even though I didn't necessarily wrestle, a lot of Japanese legends too, like Takayama and Kawada, and to just see how they wrestled and just be in their presence and watch how they did things and kind of keep my eyes open as far as how they were presenting themselves and how they put their matches together. It was just such a learning experience. There were so many situations like that too. I was the only foreigner on a handful of tours too, which at that point in time, like, it wasn't so bad for me. I think it would probably be a little more lonely now. Maybe it wouldn't though. but I was just so happy to be there and like so excited to be in Japan and have these adventures on my own that part didn't bother me. So from a mental standpoint, like I was ready to rock, man, like anything. It was just wrestling all day. And on top of that too, Japanese style is you typically get to these shows like hours beforehand. So I was able to train in the ring with so many guys. I would not have been the wrestler I became or I am today if I had spent that like year and a half in 01. It was really, really pivotal for me as far as my growth.
That's like amazing to hear.
Oh man, it was so much fun. I mean, it was just so awesome. You know, Japan was a place that like I always wanted to go when I was a kid because I was obsessed with anime from a young age and video games. And it's just presented in this like kind of sexy glow. And it was just so much fun. It's so enjoyable. I really, truly miss Japan a lot at certain points.
Real quick, how much time did you actually spend out in Japan, like all around?
So I think total, like one day I went through my passport and I checked because I have 2 passports, right? Like an old one, they expire after 10 years and then a different one. And I think all in all, I've done over 70 trips over there.
Hell yeah.
To various lengths though, you know, so there would be times where like the 01 tours were usually like 2 to 3 weeks. Sometimes for New Japan, you might be there for like 5 weeks, then go home for maybe a week, then come back for like 3 days, then go home for 2 weeks, then come back for 3 weeks. Like Japan, when I was under contract for New Japan, at least was like more intense that way. But then you might be off for like 2 months too. So it was variable. But I think, yeah, it was something like over 70 trips there, which is, you know, quite a bit, I think, in the long run.
Just a little bit.
Yeah.
Really got those frequent flyer miles in.
Yeah, I'm a million miler. And there's been times where, and this is just on Delta, but there's been times where I've gone to like check in and, oh, wow, Mr. Martin, you're very young to be a million miler. Like the people who work there. Thanks. I think.
All right. And I think the last question that we will ask is, do you have any words of wisdom or inspiration to the younger talent that either grew up watching you or look up to you now as they wrestle you?
Sure. I think this is something that I kind of wish I had known more about mentation and well-being when I started out, but you can really only control 4 things. You can control your sleep, your hydration, your mobility, and your mentation. And what I mean by that is all you can do is your best to take care of yourself and have a positive attitude. If you're doing your best, then be content with that. And sometimes that's tough because as human beings, we always want more. But literally, wrestling is a long game. If you want to be in it for the long haul, then you have to treat it like a marathon and not a sprint. So if you can be just 1% better than you were the day before, shit, if you can be 0.001% better than you were the day before, then you're on the right path. And you have to forgive yourself for mistakes if you make them, and you can't compare yourself to others. That's about it.
I think that's just great general life advice, to be honest.
Thanks.
I think that no matter what career you go into or how you're feeling, you should always, like, you should never be hard on yourself, especially if you have to take a step back here and there. I think you just need to, you know, we're all really hard on ourselves, all of us. And we need to stop doing it. We need to stop comparing ourselves to people. We need to go our own pace.
Yep. I would say you can either beat yourself up over failure, or you can look at it this way. You either win or you learn. You don't lose. And I think in wrestling, if you can take something away from every experience to make yourself a little bit better, you'll do just fine in the long run. Because again, this isn't something that happens overnight. It's not easy to do. It is not easy. Some of the greatest athletes in the world have tried pro wrestling and not been able to accomplish it. Some of the greatest intellects in the world have been able to step foot in the ring and not physically accomplish what they need to do on a basal level, let alone on a high level. So there's a lot of people who try this and it is not for them. If it's for you and you're already succeeding at it, and you feel like you've got the potential to improve and you love it, man, keep going with it. But remember, it's going to be a slow burn.
All right. Well, Alex, thank you again so much for joining us. This has been an absolute pleasure to interview you.
Oh, guys, thank you so much. I really appreciate it.
Before we go, is there anything that you are doing, any upcoming appearances that you would like to promote?
Nope. This is all you guys.
All right. Well, then, once again, thank you, Wrestle Buddies. I've been Matty. This has been Bam. And this has been an absolute wrestling legend and Alex Shelly. We thank you once again for watching. And this is the part where we wave. Bye.